Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, at least here in London. I'm Anna from the Food Foundation, and this is part of our Quick Bites series. And I'm very delighted to have a guest joining us all the way from Mexico. You're very warmly welcome, Jose Luis Chicoma. It's fantastic to have you with me today. And this is part of a little mini series that we're doing, which is trying to bring inspiration from other countries into the UK to help us think through some of these really challenging areas of food policy that we're facing in the UK and bring as best we can some of the lessons and good ideas that other countries are exploring onto our horizon so that we are drawing on evidence from across the globe for how we think about some of these challenges here in the UK. And Jose Luis is a former minister in Peru. He was the Minister of Production during the period of 2020 to 2021, when there was a sort of centrist government in Peru. You were also a minister 10 years prior to that, weren't you? On small enterprises and industry, if I've got that right. But a very warm welcome, Jose Luis. Great to have you with me.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation and for trying to create these bridges between countries that don't necessarily have that much in common, but they do, like the UK and Peru.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's what I think there's actually a lot of common ground when we chatted before, and I've heard you speak. What we're really diving into today is what are the tools that governments have to try and improve access to affordable, healthy food for everyone, and particularly those citizens that might not have a lot of income to spend on food. And you took quite an interesting step when you were a minister in Peru to particularly think about the role of markets in getting fresh produce to people at affordable prices. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I think it's really relevant to the UK's context because we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis still. We have large proportions. Our estimates are there's about 10% of households are struggling to put food on the table. That jumps to 15% if you've got children, 15% of households. And very many households are unable to afford a healthy diet. And so the government is really thinking seriously about what it can do in this area. So I think your experience is really relevant. But tell us a little bit, first of all, about the context in Peru, which sort of led up to this policy decision around markets that you took. What was the challenge you were trying to address?
Yes, thank you. So for a long time, like in many other countries in the world, affordable and healthy food access in Peru was like one of the main challenges, but not necessarily recognized as such in the political agenda. I think this is similar in many countries, including in many places, including the UK, where it has entered more recently in the political agenda. So that had been an issue for decades, also obscured by the fact that at one point the objective was affordable access to food, and it didn't matter what type of food it was. So industrial supply chains that produced cheap calories were regarded as the future. And in that sense, one of the components of those industrial supply chains, which is the modern retail, like supermarkets and convenience stores, was seen as the future, and traditional food markets were seen as relics from the past. No, they are obsolete. They were built, some of these buildings. And I should probably like talk about what I mean by traditional food markets. Traditional food markets in the global south represent one of the main ways in which the people get their food, access their food. And it's a broad concept. The broad concept includes these public, municipal, local markets that were probably built between 170 or so years ago. Buildings that are owned by the traders or in a joint partnership with the city, with local governments. and they were the main way in which people access their food in the past, but that didn't change in the last few decades, and there are still some of the main ways in which people access their food. But it's not only these local markets, it's also farmers markets, mobile markets, temporary markets that are there just once a week, and also farmers markets that in some bigger cities are like they cater the more like urban elite
Yeah.
because of the prices. But in some smaller towns and villages, they are the way in which people get their food once a week.
Yeah. Okay. And so what was going wrong with it? Was it that those markets were just falling apart and not being invested in, or like were people no longer using them? What was the sort of proportion of food that was being bought in supermarkets at that point? Was it the majority of people's groceries, or what's the kind of context
In,
there?
in Peru, it's around 70% of the food that is accessed through these traditional food markets. That percentage varies in different countries. In many countries in Africa, it's going to be higher. In other countries, even in Latin America, like Brazil or Argentina, the percentage is lower. Supermarkets have like inserted more their business model in the supply chain. So it changes, but Peru is an example of the 70%. Mexico depends how you measure that. It's around 65 or 60%. So they are quite important still because supermarkets came to supply chains in the US probably like 100, more than 100 years ago, later in Europe, and they expanded around like 5, 6 decades. And now in the UK, I guess because of a previous conversation with you, that there is around 95% or more of the food accessed through supermarkets. Even with the strong waves of what we call supermarketization in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, they are still important. Even with the wave of supermarketization, traditional food markets are still important. But in the 80s and 90s, as it happened in the UK, in the US, and in many countries in the global south, these neoliberal reforms were implemented, structural adjustment reforms in the global south, that diminished the role of the state in many different sectors of the economy. That included food supply chains,
Yeah.
where they had some responsibility before in promoting better food access. After the 80s or 90s, the idea of the politicians and the policymakers was we don't have anything to do with that. Like the market has to secure the access for everybody and it will give like different options. That wasn't necessarily the case, of course. Even after the supermarketization, traditional food markets are important. But what happened is that they were overlooked and marginalized because they represented the past and not the future. So, with the idea that supermarkets were going to take over completely, policymakers reduced the public budgets destined to strengthen the infrastructure of the supermarkets, to strengthen their connections with the smallholder farmers and with local biodiversity. Because that wrong idea around modernization, modernity. So that's what happened when I got there. It was a particularly problematic context. It was November 2020. We started in this transitional government. We're just going to complete one more year of 9 more months of the administration. Peru has had like a lot of political instability in the last 10 years, but with that short period of time, we still decided to put this as a political priority. It was during COVID. The second wave was about to start in Peru. But what happened with COVID is that more attention was paid to these markets because
Okay.
people
So,
started analyzing, like if we do a lockdown, people still need to access the markets. And then we started analyzing even like the consumption patterns. Many low income families go daily to the market because they get a daily income from many of their economic activities. So they had to go to the market frequently, so lockdowns were in many ways not necessarily that effective. But going back to the markets, then everybody started looking at the markets and saying what, like to analyze the dynamics of the markets. They were something that was completely overlooked for decades, and then we started analyzing what's the situation with the markets, why do consumers go every day, and then when I got there with a background. Yeah, I had been vice minister before many years ago, but I was always like 10 years before that, when I was vice minister, I was always focused on food value chains, how the food value chains can create better livelihoods, like increase the incomes of like the smallholder farmers, small scale fisheries, and all the like the intermediaries and processors, but never with a lens of food access. After that, I had like devoted my career after being vice minister to food systems, and I came in with a different mindset. And when I came, I said, let's make this a priority. It's one of the main challenges in a country that is so proud of its biodiversity, but we don't necessarily use that biodiversity to feed the people better. We use it for a promotion of the country of having better restaurants, which is great, but not necessarily for that. So I came with that political priority.
Fascinating. And there's lots of parallels, I think. I mean, you talked a bit about the sort of idea that the state can sort of step away from thinking about the food supply in sort of the confidence that the market and the supermarkets in particular have got it covered. And I think there is a few kind of prominent academics here in the UK who sort of talk about, well, we've just outsourced the food supply to Tesco, which is our biggest supermarket here in the UK, and it's sort of no longer of government concern in that sense. But as you've described here in the UK, COVID obviously shone a very different light on what the government responsibility is in this space and what might be new modes of government intervention. It didn't point us towards our policymakers towards markets, sadly, but nevertheless, it created a different type of conversation about what does the government need to do to ensure that we are shoring up our supply chains. So I think I wanted to pick up on this point about that you moved into latterly there about the connection between markets, the connection between sort of agroecological producers and consumers, every consumer, not just those who are of a higher income. And it's particularly relevant today, interestingly, because though we hadn't planned it quite this way, as I mentioned to you just before, we had one of our partners, Sustain, launched a fantastic report yesterday called Bridging the Gap, which was a culmination of a whole number of pilots that they've been running over the last few years to try and test different ways of enabling access to organic food, fruit and veg in particular, for lower income, at affordable prices for low income families. And they looked at a whole raft of different methods for doing that. And yesterday they published the findings from all of that work. And it was a very impactful event, which they hosted yesterday afternoon with a lot of examples which revealed why some of these supply chains are not emerging in the UK. What are the barriers that they face? And one of the things they really face is this gap in regional infrastructure. It relates to your point really around these traditional markets, which are kind of structures, they're elements of towns and cities, which belong to the municipality and the traders. And I'm interested to know so tell us a little bit more about what that policy intervention exactly was. Was it funding or was it something else? What were you actually trying to enable, and did you kind of achieve what you set out to achieve in terms of were you looking for demonstrable impacts in terms of access to nutritious foods for low income families? Were you able to tell whether you'd succeeded in doing that?
Yes, a couple of things for context. I think in the end, in the UK or in the US or in Peru or in Mexico, people are going to find this affordable access to a diverse set of products for a healthy diet through different means. It's going to be a mix probably of supermarkets, and in Peru and in Mexico or many places in Africa and Asia, it's going to be also traditional food markets, but also some community kitchens and some other means. So in the end, we need to promote this diverse array of options in which consumers can access these healthy products. From our perspective, we had just focused in Peru for decades on the supermarkets or left the market to work in this supply and demand way to put like to define in some ways what consumers could eat, and this was mostly industrial and in many ways like cheap calories was the most accessible set of products. So in the end, with considering that, we said like we need to improve the infrastructure of these markets that have been overlooked in the public budget. So we accelerated the process for the public budget for those sense of markets all over the country that needed an urgent improvement and modernization of all like their infrastructure, from the stalls to the water supply to the waste management. So that was the initial one. We worked together with the Ministry of Economic and Finance. It's usually the most important ministry in any country. And we tried to convince them that this was an urgency. So we created this, what we call in Peru, I didn't create this, it was in a previous administration, an executive table, which is an executive committee. In an executive
Okay.
committee, the Ministry of Economic and Finance, the most powerful ministry, convened other ministries to solve the problems and obstacles and bottlenecks that different sectors had for their growth and development. Of course, they
Okay.
usually were focused in industrial agriculture, in the energy sector, like for mining, because their objective in the end was to increase GDP growth, of course. But we came with this idea, and in the end, they they said, "Are you sure, Minister, you want to create an executive committee for this?" And I said, "Yes, because of all the impacts, and we didn't have that much data globally around this issue that they are like that they have increased affordable, healthy food access." Not at the global level at that point, which was 2020, and not at the Peruvian level, but we had some statistics, including that magic number, the 70% of
Mhm.
food that is distributed through these channels. So we convinced them to made it not only a political priority in a ministry like the one I was running, but at the like broader government level. So they had the power to convene the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Public Health to implement some reforms around food safety, the Ministry of Housing, because many of the issues that these traditional food markets face is an insecure land tenure.
Okay.
They were probably like had some partnership with the local governments, but it wasn't clear who owned the land or the infrastructure that they had. So we convened different ministries together for the length of our administration to work together with my ministry, with the Ministry of Economic and Finance, and also with the association of the traders, of the workers of these traditional food markets. And we secured different commitments. I would say that 50% of the commitments were carried on after we left the government, after the administration ended, which in a
Mhm.
highly unstable political context is actually like an achievement. So it was great. And going back to a broader reflection, I remember meeting with these representatives from like the traders, the workers. Many of them were like low income workers that had to find the time to meet with the ministers in many ways. They were not necessarily that organized. And at the beginning, I said, "You are going to be the political priority." I saw it was by Zoom because it was during one of the lockdowns. But I saw like a little bit of skepticism in their faces, like they were probably thinking, "Oh, another new minister that is telling us the same story and nothing is going to happen. But after all that we did, the last week of of our administration, I like presented all the progress that we've made. And I thought that they were going to complain. I said, no, it wasn't enough. No, they have this legitimate anger towards policymakers and politicians. But in the end, they said, almost crying, also on Zoom, saying that you made us feel that we were not invisible for the first time in the political agenda. So, besides the public budget and many of the things that we approved regarding public health or infrastructure or even land tenure, I think it was the idea that we had put like one of the most important issues for food systems transformation or food access on top of the political agenda, and that they could in the future also demand that from other politicians and policymakers. So I think now, even globally, it's higher on the political agenda. 2 years ago, I participated in a report from the high-level panel of experts, and we recommended that this should be one of the priorities in the global south for food access. But if we move these ideas from the global south to the global north and to other places, I think is that the issue of affordability should be like one of the top issues on food systems transformation. I've been working on this for many years, and for many years, organic, sustainable food access and healthy was promoted without the question or without facing the challenge that most of this production was going to be very expensive and that it was only going to cater for an urban elite
Yeah.
or many
I mean, that's
working.
definitely the perception here that if as soon as you move out of the supermarket context, you're going to be paying a price premium, and that therefore that's a nice pursuit for wealthy elites who might have access to a farmer's market. So I think that's in part because we've had this huge divestment in the regional infrastructure, so that now for a small producer to get their product to market is quite an elaborate process that they need to go through because there isn't this infrastructure in place. I mean, that's one of the reasons. And I mean, part of that is sort of subsidized essentially in Peru, right?
Not necessarily subsidized. I think that by supporting these traditional supply chains, and like you said, it's not only the markets by itself, it's like the rest of the supply chain that
Yeah.
is going to work better with locally produced products and is going to cater like to the preferences and tastes also of local consumers. I think we need to have like a different perspective on these food supply chains. In many cases in the global south, they were developed for decades to produce good quality products to export or only for the urban elites in Lima, the capital of Peru, but not necessarily for local populations. And there are like many different, it's called innovation centers all over the country, funded by the government to help local producers to process their products. For example, and I was mentioning this, like we have one of the richest oceans in the world and the biggest fishery, the Peruvian anchovy, which is more like the Italian sardine in size and in how fat it is. And we process 99% of this anchovy to transform it to fish oil and fish meal, exported to China as aquaculture feed for other fishes and for poultry also. But we don't use that to address the local food security needs. And we actually, there's like the idea that these anchovies are not tasty enough, are not delicious. In one of these centers, we were helping local producers to transform these anchovies, smoke them and like canned them, and they were delicious, like some of the best sardines that you can get in the world. But we always thought that that support was only to support these producers to export those anchovies, not to direct them to the local markets that needed those anchovies and the omega-3 and all those nutritious qualities that it has more. So So we need to change that. Like a lot of the support, the public support has to be directed to improve affordable food access.
So you're describing this sort of disconnect, aren't you, between the political backing for Peru's, you know, sort of world leadership, if you like, on amazing food, like for both tourism and sort of the global reputation of the country and high quality produce and all of that. That's sort of in some ways politically separate from a different challenge, which is how you feed the nation and whether what aspiration you set for feeding the nation. And I'm trying to think about whether we've got a parallel here in the UK. I mean, certainly what I suppose perhaps the closest thing I can think of is that in the UK we have a huge number of cookery programs on television. Like it's a huge industry. And chef competitions, all kinds of stuff. You'd think if you were watching our telly that we would be a nation of cooks cooking delicious, like locally grown food if you watched our TVs, but the story is quite different from that. Um, and perhaps there's a sort of similar sort of disconnect. And do you have any reflections on how did you try and bridge those two worlds in Peru?
It's very similar in Peru because of the success that Peruvian gastronomy and cuisine has had all over the world. Lima is one of the cities that has more awards for these best restaurants in the world. Right now has
Yeah.
like the best restaurant, Maido. So the chefs are celebrities also, like Jamie Oliver is globally, and we have our Jamie Olivers, like many of them, and they're actually like very active in promoting better food access. But that hasn't translated, and that's the responsibility of different administrations historically in the last 20 years. That hasn't translated necessarily in better food access in general. We haven't worked on the whole like systemic approach, and actually affordability of these healthy diets hasn't been top on the political agenda, which is represents this like immense contradiction that shouldn't happen. If we're proud of our cuisine and we're obsessed with food, that should be one of the main political priorities. Whether we agree or not with Mamdani in New York, there's a politician that has put affordability to the core of the political agenda, including actually like food access, with the idea that in New York they should run public grocery stores. He's picking up on some of the ideas that have been floating around, using the efficiencies of supermarkets. And some of the scholars, like Raj Patel, say that it's the efficiency of the US Army supply chains, but use them in a way that they can provide subsidized access, affordable access to healthy products and focus on healthy products. In the end, the business model of supermarkets is so efficient, the logistical
Mm.
aspect is so efficient and so well developed, but in the end, the business model is focused on a narrow set of products. And in many cases, we need to correct that market failure. I'm speaking as an economist, but it's a market failure of one of the ways in which citizens can access better food. I know that the supermarkets have evolved, of course, evolved in the last 20 years also globally to offer more diversity of healthy and fresh products, but still at a premium. So there's a rationale for public and community intervention coordinated that can like copy in some ways the efficiencies of supermarkets and convenience stores, but focused on healthy products that is not necessarily in the business model currently of these modern supply chains.
Yeah. Super interesting. Lots to think about because there's a huge body of, I would call this social retail emerging now in the UK, food pantries, community supermarkets, food clubs, a whole range of different innovations which are happening in communities, largely in response to the very acute cost of living crisis that we've been going through. But I think it's interesting to think about whether they potentially offer the opportunity for some of these supply chains to emerge, of actually linking smaller producers producing to higher environmental standards directly with consumers, and creating more of that diversity of offer that you're talking about, which we kind of need for health and environmental reasons. Jose Luis, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. And I just wanted to just remind everyone what our next, we've got two more webinars coming up before Christmas. One, which we'll be talking to the former minister in Denmark about their plant-based food plan, and the other, which is launching our State of the Food Industry report. So do join us if you can. The links to sign up are in the chat. And if you'd like to, sign up to the newsletter and the podcast. Great to see you. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Anna. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.